Hello, test, test. Okay, hi everyone. I just shared the link with the Class My Courses page. So I'm just gonna wait a couple minutes until more people join us. For those of you that are already here, if you could just say something on the chat, just say like hey or hi or yes if you can hear me, um, just to be sure that things are going okay. All right, so Jeremy can hear me. Okay, I'm just gonna give it another couple minutes. Thank you, Yana. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And by the way, there seems to be a little bit of a delay of like 10 seconds or something like that. So just be mindful of that. I may not be answering to you guys' messages in real time. Okay, so I'm gonna start at 8:05. So for those of you who are early, just kick back, watch watch the snow outside. Seems to have stopped for the meantime. I fell on the ice on my way home today, so I hope you guys' journey home was a little less eventful. Okay, for those of you who are joining us now, I'm just waiting until it's 8:05. We're going to start at 8:05. Okay, so it's 8:05 for me. So welcome to the second review session for exam review number 1. My name is JV. I'm one of your Tomlinson team members for the course. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be answering the messages on the discussion board. Last time I checked, the discussion board was today at something like 1 p.m. So if you sent a very last minute question, I haven't seen it yet. I will get to it if there's time at the end. And if you have any questions about unrelated content to what I'm presenting right now, if there's time in the end, I'll be taking those kind of questions. Now, if you have a question about something that I'm presenting about in my slides, like for example, if I'm explaining something and you think the explanation wasn't clear, or you have a question about something I just said, just use the chat function. Like I said before, there seems to be a delay, so I may not look at it right away, but if the moment I spot it, I'm going to get back to my slides and try to make sure everything is clear. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to start with the questions. So the first one that I got was from Jeremy, I think, and he asked, what are the differences you can use to tell apart mania from hypomania? Oh yeah, just by the way, it's the first time I'm doing like a stream in this setting, so if there's any problems throughout, like if you stop hearing me, you stop seeing something, just again use the chat. So yeah, mania and hypomania. So the book talks a little bit about this. They're the same symptoms and the same amount of symptoms, but hypomania only needs to be present for 4 days, and mania must be present for at least 1 week. So to me, it seems like that's the only distinction between the two. So if it's something, if it's an episode, but it was present for between 4 to 7 days, that is hypomania. So if it was present for, say, something like 6 days, still hypomania. The moment it's over 1 week, that's where it starts getting into mania territory. So next question. If you have any questions about this one, let me know in the chat. So this one is PDD, persistent depressive disorder, previously known as dysthymia. So is that just chronic low mood? Or does it come in episodes like MDD? So major depressive disorder, I think to meet criteria. Oh, so I just got an answer between a question between mania versus psychosis. So I'm just going to go back to the mania one. So I don't know what you mean by psychosis. I think you may mean psychosis. So psychosis is something usually referred to when we're talking about like schizophrenia, which you guys are going to get into later in the semester. There's a unit on schizophrenia. There's a text chapter on schizophrenia. It's basically when you're thinking about things like delusions or hallucinations. So patients with schizophrenia, they will sometimes... this happens in other disorders, but schizophrenia is the most common. And of course, there's MDD with psychotic symptoms, which I'm going to get to later. But psychosis, it seems like it's a more of a delusion kind of state, more of a hallucination. So something like, for example, if you're watching the TV and you think that some messages are directed to you. So people with schizophrenia or psychosis, they will experience that. That's a delusion. Mania, it's more of just like a state of, agitation. And like we talked in the lectures with Kay Redfield Jameson, I think, like going and shopping very impulsively and things like that. Sometimes it may have psychotic features, but not necessarily. It's really... I'm gonna pull the criteria really quickly for mania just to help out for a manic episode. Yeah, so persistently elevated, expansive or irritable mood, inflated self-esteem, decreased need for sleep, more talkative than usual, flight of ideas, excessive involvement in activities that have a high potential for painful circumstances. Delusions of grandeur, question by Kelly. So that's a good question. The grandiosity that happens in mania doesn't necessarily have a psychotic. So Yana, I'm gonna get into psychotic MDD later. There's a question only about that, so I'll put a pin on that. But grandiosity and mania doesn't necessarily involve psychosis. It may just, be very inflated self-esteem. It would be psychosis if it was something like, starting to think that you were a god, or that God sent you on Earth. That kind of thing would be entering like delusional territory. So it can be psychotic, but not necessarily. You can just think that, you can take on everything. You can I don't know, that you can things that are realistic, but just still like grandiose. That's grandiosity, and it's not necessarily psychotic or has delusions. So Yana, like I said, psychotic MDD I'm gonna get to later. Juan's question: should we memorize all data in the table of rates of disorders and probands and relatives? So Juan, this doesn't really relate to my question right now, so I'm gonna get to other questions at the end. First, I'm going to tackle all the discussion board questions. So I'll put a pin on that. If there's time in the end, I'm going to take other questions. And then you can ask me again later, okay? But for now, only questions that are about the material that I'm presenting, that are the questions that were on the discussion board. So seems like there's no more questions about this one, so I'm going to go to the next. So the PDD question... So persistent depressive disorder and major depressive disorder, like I was saying, major depressive disorder, you only need to be depressed and meet criteria for about 2 weeks. PDD, you need to have been experiencing low mood and the other related symptoms for about 2 years. So because it's such it's a very chronic thing. It's a very it doesn't really come in episodes like MDD does. But that said, like the book states, I think Dr. Weinberg mentioned this in the lecture too. They're not completely independent things. Individuals with persistent depressive disorder can also experience recurrent episodes of major depressive disorder. And of course, you can be diagnosed with PDD and then remit and stop meeting criteria and be healthy. But then once again, if 2 years from then you meet criteria again, you can be diagnosed again. I wouldn't really call that an episode though, because episodes are more like shorter, in a shorter time frame. That's really like an MDD thing. So yeah, I'm gonna wait a little bit to see if there's any questions about this. If not, I'm gonna skip to the next one. If I'm speaking too fast, by the way, feel free to let me know too. I can slow down. For those of you who joined us just recently, welcome. So Jeremy, the SAD mood have to be pretty much constant over the 2-year period, then for PDD. So yes, I'm going to have another look at the criteria for PDD really quick. But I think that depressed mood... XD, I'm going to get to your question in just a little bit. Let me just tackle this one. Yeah, so Jeremy's question. So in the DSM-5 criteria for PDD, it has depressed mood for most of the day, for more days than not, for at least 2 years. So SAD mood, to answer your question, yes, it has to be pretty much constant over the 2-year period. You have to have depressed mood for most of the day, for most days in that 2-year period. Now for XD, when a person dies, MDD, so that's also, I'm going to answer this because it's a quick one, but not super related to this, but it's okay, I'm going to answer it anyway. So the bereavement clause, it used to be, I think up until DSM-4, there was a bereavement clause where if you were suffering from feelings of depression because of death of a loved one, grief, then you wouldn't meet criteria for depression because that was seen to be culturally expected. They removed it now in DSM-5, so you can still meet criteria for MDD even if you are experiencing grief, but you need to be meeting all the criteria. And of course, it has to be the criteria. I think they mention how it has to be kind of outside the bounds of outside what is expected in your culture. So Megan Goldwax, what's the difference between chronic major depression and PDD? As far as I know, there isn't anything on the DSM that is for chronic major depression. So yeah, so I guess if as far as I know, the DSM doesn't include chronic major depression. Correct me if I'm wrong. If it does, I'd expect the criteria to be slightly different. But yeah, I don't think there's chronic major depression in the DSM. I think it's just major depressive disorder and PDD. And then the differences are the criteria for PDD are a little more flexible. So over here, yeah, for major depressive disorder, you have to have 5 or more symptoms. For PDD, only depressed mood and then 2 or more. So 3 symptoms overall, but PDD is over a much longer period of time, 2 years compared to MDD being 2 weeks. So yeah, like I said, I don't think there's chronic major depression in the DSM. Correct me if I'm wrong. And also, everyone feel free to email the TA email account after the review session if anything I said was left unclear or you have any more questions. So I'm going to move on to the next one. So this one was, what are the intermediate beliefs in cognitive theory? So this was mentioned both in chapter 1 when it was talking, I think it's chapter 1, when it's talking about the theories behind psychopathology, and also mentioned in chapter 8. So Aaron Beck, I put cognitive theory of depression because his theory was mainly for so Megan, email me the question afterwards, and I'll get to your question. I'm gonna look into it. I wasn't aware of that, but anyway. So intermediate beliefs in cognitive theory. Aaron Beck. It's basically I'm just recap, like summing up cognitive theory so this makes sense. There's 3 levels of cognitions that contribute to depression and psychopathology in general, but Aaron Beck, when he came up with this theory, it was specific for depression. So first level is schemas, core beliefs. So it's something more stable and very kind of like a chronic pattern of thinking about yourself. I'm going to skip to the third level now because intermediate beliefs are basically the bridge in between the two. So the third level is automatic thoughts. So that's situation-specific, quick thoughts. And then in between are intermediate beliefs. So if you think about it, according to Aaron Beck, depressed people, they have maladaptive cognitions or styles of thinking in each of these 3 levels. So for example, someone who's depressed, if they fail a test, their automatic thought is they go like, I failed the test because I am a terrible student. So there's tons of different reasons why someone might fail a test. They might fail because the questions were unclear. Maybe I don't know, so many things. Like maybe they had a death in the family and they couldn't study properly. Maybe they just didn't understand the material very well, but they're actually a very intelligent person, just didn't grasp that material that well. But someone with depression would really kind of attribute that to themselves. They would go like, oh yeah, the reason I failed is because I am terrible. I'm a terrible student. Intermediate is something more like generalizing from that specific situation, that specific test, to more situations. So something like, if I fail a test, it means I am a terrible student. Or something like, I shouldn't bother trying to study for a test because I'm going to fail it because I'm a terrible student. That's an intermediate belief. And a core belief is something that's, just from a very general belief about yourself that can be applied to many different situations. So something like, I am incompetent, or I'm not smart. That would be a core belief. So to answer the question, intermediate beliefs are kind of in between. It's kind of generalizing from that specific situation to more kinds of situations. Okay, so if there are no questions about that, I'm gonna skip to the next one. So this was a little bit of a longer question. So the book says there was a common theme of a mind-body distinction in ancient Greek thought, but Hippocrates did not distinguish mental diseases from physical diseases, and Aristotle denied the influence of psychological factors in the etiology of dysfunctional thinking and behavior. Therefore, how does the author support that the mind-body distinction was very prominent in ancient Greek philosophy? So I reread that part of the book just to get a grasp on it a little bit, and it seems like Hippocrates. I couldn't find a specific sentence saying the mind-body distinction was very prominent in ancient Greek philosophy. I only found that actually after it talks about Hippocrates and Aristotle. So this is a little, I think, beyond the scope of this class to know this very in detail. So keep that in mind. It's just like a general overview of, ancient views on psychopathology. But to me, it seems like the book talks about Hippocrates and Socrates. No, not Socrates, Aristotle. And then it talks about how it emerged various schools of thought that rejected his theories of mental illness, and then that regarded mental illness as a disorder that resulted from constriction of body tissue or relaxation of those tissues. So yeah, it seems like the book frames the mind-body distinction being a prominent thought after Hippocrates and Aristotle's time. And it also mentions, I forgot his name, but it mentions also another thinker that did live during the time where it was a prominent idea, the idea of mind-body distinction. But it was like, oh yeah, the book said something like he's an exception. He was an exception. And it's just to keep in mind, just because one or two thinkers went against a prominent idea in a certain time zone, it doesn't mean that it wasn't a prominent idea. For something to be a prominent idea, not everyone has to agree with it. So keep that in mind as well. So, but like I said, keep in mind that this is a little beyond the scope of the course. So I don't think it's necessary to know all of this in much detail. Just know the general ideas and the general views on psychopathology. Okay, so next question is about diaphyses stress models. So in lecture 2, slide 25, what are the differences between the first and second graph, apart from the differential impact of no diaphyses? I mean, really, there doesn't seem to be a lot different between the two, apart from the differential impact of no diaphyses. There are just two ways of interpreting the diaphysis stress model, where in the top graph, if you don't have a diaphysis, if you don't have a vulnerability, no matter what level of stress, you're not going to, the probability of depression is not going to increase. And another view says that, if you experience very high stress, even if you have a low diaphysis, there's your probability of depression are going to increase with stress. So yeah, apart from the differential impact of no diaphysis, there doesn't seem to be much different between the two. And this is another thing that I think is a little of a too detailed level of analysis. I think the most important thing is to know what is diaphysis, what is stress, and kind of like the ways the two may interact and the premise behind that theory. Okay, so if there are no questions about that one either, I'm going to go to the next one. So that one is, why is bipolar 1 more specifically familial than MDD? So that was referring to that table. That's what's on slide 29 of lecture 5. So if you see this table over here, if relatives have a diagnosis of bipolar 1, the chance of a proband having bipolar 1 is 3%, and the chance of the proband having 1%, MDD is 1%. And in MDD, the chances of the proband having bipolar 1 is 10%, and MDD is 14%. So that's, I think, what the person meant by bipolar 1 being more specifically familial than a major depressive disorder. And the answer to that is, I don't know. Um, and I don't know if this is known in the literature specifically. It's very hard to know exactly what makes a disorder more familial than others. Um, yeah, there isn't. So sorry, I'm just seeing Erica's comment. So yeah, thank you, Erica. That seems to answer Megan's question, but if it doesn't, just again shoot me an email. Dash, I'm gonna take answers that are unrelated to my slides at the end of the session when there's time. So keep a pin on that and ask me again once I'm done with the slides that were all the questions from the discussion board, because I'm prioritizing those. So yeah, going back to bipolar 1 and MDD, really it's kind of unknown in the literature. We don't really know why it's more familial than MDD. The important thing to know is just the general concepts behind this table. So not things like a specific percentage, but just, knowing things like, yes, like bipolar 1 being more specifically familial than MDD. You don't have to know the reason why unless Dr. Weinberg talks about it in the class. So next one. So yeah, I said someone asked earlier about what psychotic MDD is, and this is the question that relates to that. So someone asked what are the differences between psychotic, melancholic, and atypical unipolar depression. So by the way, this was before yesterday's lecture, Monday evening's lecture. So if you haven't seen yesterday's lecture, Dr. Weinberg in the beginning of the lecture went quite in depth on the distinction between melancholic and atypical. So I'm just gonna repeat most of what she said for those two. I really recommend you to listen to that if you still have any doubts. Psychotic is quite different from the two, so I included this question anyway. So psychotic is with delusions or hallucinations, and those can be mood congruent or incongruent. Though in unipolar depression, mood incongruent is very rare. So, like I was saying earlier, delusions and hallucinations are a core symptom of other mental illnesses like schizophrenia, which has a chapter in the book which we're gonna cover later in this semester. But what you need to know for now is that it's just, I think Dr. Weinberg went over this quickly. It's just things that are a little outside. A delusion is having a thought that is not grounded in reality. So having a thought that is just, it's hard to explain because it seems sometimes that those are, no one would think that kind of stuff, but there are people who suffer from delusions and hallucinations. So the idea, the explanation, the example I had earlier was, for example, if you're watching the TV and you think that that message is targeted directly to you. So if I'm watching like SpongeBob, and they say something like, be scared of the man with the glasses. And I go like, oh my God, that's me. They're talking about me. Like SpongeBob, he's onto me. He wants to come after me. That's an example of a delusion. I'm going to see if I can just have a look again at these, the criteria for psychotic MDD. It's not on the book. I'm going to look it up quickly. But yes, psychotic is really delusions or hallucinations. And yes, to answer Jeremy's question, mood incongruent psychosis with depression would be just positive things. Yeah. So anything positive, any kind of positive delusion. So things like, for example, I am the son of God, and I was sent to this earth by God to promote peace. So that's a positive thing. So if I had that kind of delusion while I was depressed, that's a mood incongruent psychotic depression. Mood congruent would be something more negative. So like the example I said earlier, SpongeBob is onto me, or like if you're walking on the street and you see a man behind you and you think he's stalking you, and then even after that you can't see that man, you still think that man is gonna follow you and like come home and harm you or something like that. That's another example of a delusion. So yeah. So if you need more examples of delusions or hallucinations, let me know. But that's it for psychotic. Melancholic is really where the core symptom is anhedonia. So to meet criteria for major depressive disorder, you need to have one of two cardinal or core symptoms, either anhedonia or depressed mood. For you to meet criteria for melancholic, it has to be anhedonia. So of course you can also have depressed mood, but you must be meeting the anhedonia criteria, which is really a very severe loss of interest or pleasure for really most things or everything. So even things that you used to enjoy before, like for example, if you played a sport that you really liked, or you played an instrument and you really liked doing that, but then all of a sudden you stop feeling pleasure or interest in those things. You don't want to play that sport. You don't want to play that instrument. That's what anhedonia kind of is. And then there's some other symptoms as well, which are pretty similar to the depression, the MDD, just general symptoms, but some of them are more specific. So, for example, significant weight loss is a symptom for melancholic. For MDD, you can have significant weight loss or gain, I believe. For melancholic, it has to be weight loss. So it's just a different type of major depressive disorder. With these specific kind of symptoms. And atypical is a core symptom of intact mood reactivity, and then two or more of significant weight gain or appetite increase, hypersonia, lead-in paralysis, and a long-standing pattern of sensitivity to interpersonal rejection, resulting in significant... I'm sorry, by the way, my webcam is cutting off a little bit of the slides, but it says resulting in significant social or occupational impairment. So, but once again, if you're still confused about the differences between the two, check the last lecture. Right in the beginning of the lecture, Dr. Weinberg gave a very good overview of melancholic and atypical. So the next one is specifically about the PDD section on the textbook. So it says that it's characterized by... there is a discrepancy in the textbook where in the actual text it says that PDD is characterized by chronic low mood with at least 3 associated symptoms. But then on an actual table it says that while depressed, you need to meet 2 or more of the following symptoms. So yeah, the textbook is a little confusing. So in the text, like I said, it says chronic low mood with 3 symptoms. Table says depressed mood plus 2 or more other symptoms. So I went and actually looked in the DSM-5. And by the way, the DSM-5 is available for all of us McGill students through the McGill Library. It's available as an ebook. If you just go mcgill.ca/library, just type up in the search bar DSM-5, you can actually see the actual DSM. Sometimes that's, obviously it's way too long. You don't have to memorize anything that's there and not on the textbook. But it's pretty interesting. Sometimes if you're curious, you can always look into that. So yeah, I went and I looked into that in the actual DSM-5. So it says the same as the table on the textbook, which is depressed mood for most of the day, for more days than not, for at least 2 years, plus 2 or more associated symptoms. So it does seem to be what the table says. Depressed mood plus 2 or more other symptoms. So I think the text maybe included depressed mood as one of the 3 symptoms that I mentioned. I think that's the reason behind the discrepancy. So yeah, it's depressed mood for most of the day, for more days than not, plus 2 or more associated symptoms. So I'm just going to have a look at the questions. Yeah, so Yana, the treatment for all or most specifiers of NDD are it is the same. Yeah. Why have so many specifiers if they're rather similar to each other? That's a great question. A lot of the decisions on the DSM, like we talked about in class, are pretty debatable and often quite kind of subjective or arbitrary. So I think that the reason behind having so many specifiers is for research. I think that even if the treatment is the same for uh, all the specifiers of MDD, they behave differently. They have a different course. So PDD, for example, it's very chronic. It's harder to treat, I believe. You're talking about specifiers of MDD, so that's different actually. But yeah, it's mainly if there are any significant differences that are worth noting. They do different specifiers. But yeah, it's a good question. It really poses a lot of questions on the categorical system of the DSM to have such different specifiers that seem pretty similar to each other. So yeah, it's a great question that I can't really answer fully, unfortunately. Marley, the difference between lack of mood reactivity and anhedonia. So I believe that anhedonia is mostly like a loss of interest or pleasure, and lack of mood reactivity is something like, for example, you don't. It's not just a loss of pleasure, but also very like blunted mood. Like you just feel very neutral all the time. Not necessarily a loss of interest or pleasure in things, but just very just very blunted and very unreactive mood. Like no matter what happens, you're still with a very you still keep the same stable mood. But that's a good question. I feel like I should look into that a little more. So if you can email the course email address about this, I'm gonna look into it and see the differences. Does mood reactivity remain intact with having anhedonia? Yeah, I wouldn't say they're very. I wouldn't say they're very. They're completely independent things. So I wouldn't say that mood reactivity remains intact with anhedonia because anhedonia would affect mood reactivity. So yeah, if you could email me that question as well, I'm gonna look into the specific differences between the two. Hypo. Okay, the hypomania thing. If you could email me that as well, I can clarify it. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to skip to the next one. So for the onset of MDD, the textbook says that rates are equal for both males and females throughout childhood, and then they diverge at age 10. So then the rates would increase for females and level off for males. In the lecture, Dr. Weinberg said Mayo children are more likely to be diagnosed. Is the prevalence the same in childhood, but Mayo children are just more likely to actually be diagnosed? So yeah, that does seem to be the case. The information doesn't conflict with each other. I went through both, and it makes sense. A lot of times, Mayo children, they're sometimes because of just cultural factors. So, for example, Mayo children are culturally expected to be, more agitated and play more and that kind of thing. Sometimes that makes Mayo children, the symptoms that Mayo children suffer, be more more noticeable by parents, and then therefore that may contribute to them being more likely to be diagnosed. So prevalence could be the same, but they're just more likely to be diagnosed due to, for example, parents may be catching on the symptoms in young boys more than they do for young girls. So prevalence isn't equal to diagnosis, so that's what I suspect. So yeah, okay. Next question. So I just had a pretty broad question on twin studies to explain some of the problems mentioned in the lecture with twin studies. So in this lecture where she talks about research methods, she talks about how uh, twin studies have quite a number of problems associated with them. And then this is a few of the problems. The question that I got was only with these three problems, so those are the only ones that I'm going to target. What's bolded is the problem that I'm talking about, the problem that was on the slides, and then unbolded is kind of like my explanation. So the first problem, heritability equals genetic contributions to observed phenotype. So Dr. Weinberg mentioned this in the lecture. It's basically the idea that heritability implies that genes caused the phenotype. That's not necessarily true because genes are not deterministic, they're probabilistic. So so people have an idea that heritability is equal to genetic contributions to observed phenotype, which may not necessarily be the case. What portion of variance in the phenotype is associated with similarity on monozygotic twins? So this is actually what heritability is when we're measuring it. It's just how much variance does being a monozygotic twin explain. Having a similar genetic makeup is worth mentioning. That's associated with a greater similarity in the phenotype, but doesn't mean that it's causing it. So it's just how much variance does having a similar genetic makeup cause, not cause, but is associated with similarity in the phenotype. Doesn't necessarily mean that the genetics are causing the phenotype. And there might be quite a few reasons behind that. One of the reasons, for example, is that, like she mentioned in the lecture, monozygotic twins, they can be treated much more similarly than dizygotic twins. Just because they look alike, people will sometimes treat them very similarly. And so, that's a different environmental experience that they experience compared to dizygotic twins. So that may be behind, for example, some of the similarity in the phenotype, where the similar genetic makeup is causing people to behave similarly towards these two twins, and then that actually may be causing the similarity in the phenotype. So also worth mentioning, another problem is that they're not deterministic. So not deterministic, I glanced over this previously. What it means is that a twin study kind of implies that, it doesn't necessarily imply that, but some people may think that due to findings of twin studies that genes are causing and they dictate someone's course. So for example, if you see a heritability of 60% between monozygotic twins, so if one monozygotic twin has bipolar, there's a 60% chance that the other will have bipolar. So obviously that's way too high, but it's just for an example. So that's 60%, that's just a chance, that's a probability. It doesn't mean that the other twin is going to have bipolar, right? It doesn't mean that they even will get close to the having meeting criteria for bipolar. It's just a probability. So that's another issue with twin studies. And they also often don't model genes and environment. So just recall the idea that genes by environment, that genes are not necessarily independent from the environment. They're related. One interacts with the other through passive, evocative, active gene-environment interactions. But twin studies, because of their design, they often assume that they're separate. And they also often overestimate heritability. So that's it. I feel like I might have gone through that a little fast, so let me know if there's any questions. Like I said, just email me any questions. Email the course TA email. I'm going to be handling it tomorrow, so I'll get to all of your questions tomorrow. I'm also doing office hours tomorrow if you want to stop by for any questions, 10 to 11. So yeah, next question. Reward positivity. So I got a couple questions asking me to just go over reward RUPI, reward positivity. And I can't go over all of the findings from the lecture, so I'm going to focus on what specific things people mentioned were a little confusing. But just as a reminder, because it's a little weird to get into the specifics without having the broad idea, reward positivity is just a neural response that you see to a reward that is more positive. So I have the graph from the lecture. Remember that positive is being plotted down. So that kind of peak in the bottom, that's what reward positivity usually is. I have the photo of that girl over there. She's wearing an EEG. It's just so you guys remember that this is, we're usually measuring this using EEGs. That's what Dr. Weinberg uses in her lab, for example. That's what they look like in case you haven't seen one. So yeah, that's how we measure reward positivity. And in that chart on the right, the more blue area on the brain, so like close to the center, that's a larger reward positivity. So in depression, you see a blunted reward positivity. So in people who don't suffer from depression, we do see the reward positivity. We do see that positive brain activity after a reward, but in depression, it's blunted. It's not as strong. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's not there, but it's often significantly blunted and not as strong as those seen in the general population. So to get into the specific questions about RUPI, the family experiment, so that was from Dr. Weinberg's. So in that experiment, the proband was the person with lower positive affect, so more anhedonia, so more depressed. So the proband was the person who was depressed. And those have the blunted, or had in the experiment, blunted RUPI as expected. No surprises so far. Their sibling was the sibling with higher positive affect, so not necessarily meeting criteria for depression. So something to keep in mind is that the significance behind studying RUPI is that it might be, what Dr. Weinberg talked in lecture is that it could be a symptom of depression. It could be a scar of depression. So for example, if you're depressed, having the blunted reward positivity could be because you're depressed. It could be a symptom of your depression, or it could be a vulnerability marker. It could be something that, people who have blunted RUPIs may be more vulnerable to having depression. So because depression is heritable, that's why you do studies with siblings, to see if the sibling will also have a blunted reward positivity. So in this instance, if the sibling does not have a blunted reward positivity, that suggests that the blunted reward positivity is a symptom of depression, or a scar of depression, that it is because of depression itself. But that wasn't what the study found. So siblings were also found to have a blunted RUPI, like their depressed probands. And that was, even if you're controlling for a proband RUPI and negative affect. So that it seems to be really driven by familiality. So it seems like, what that means is that it seems that RUPI is heritable, and it suggests that RUPI is a vulnerability factor to depression. Because you have the siblings with RUPI but not meeting criteria for depression. So in that case, it should suggest they might have been vulnerable but not experienced any stressor, and that therefore not developed depression. Also worth mentioning, the third point under findings, that siblings of probands with low positive affect, so more anhedonia, have a more blunted RUPI compared to siblings of probands with high positive affect. So again, suggesting that RUPI is heritable, and that is there's something about there's an association between reward positivity in the siblings and anhedonia in their probands, in their siblings. So another quick question about RUPI, relatedness to symptoms of anxiety. So just to keep in mind, I rewatched the lecture and Dr. Weinberg skipped this part. What she had was she had the graph, but she skipped the part with the green box. She didn't really mention it. So the it seems like she's not going to test you guys in this, but it's a I would know it just to be sure because it is on the slides and it's not that difficult to remember. It's just mentioning that Rupi is unrelated to symptoms of anxiety in probands or siblings. So the significance of that is that Rupi seems to be specific to depression. So the fact that we're not seeing it in anxiety, which by the way is we're going to get into it, but quite similar to depression in many ways, very comorbid. Those people who are depressed are very often anxious as well. But Rupi seems to be completely unrelated to anxiety symptoms. So that suggests that Rupi is specific to depression. So a question about dimension hierarchical models. So by the way, it's just this is the second last question. So in a little bit, I'm going to get to any last minute questions. So the question was just, why is the model called dimensional hierarchical if there seem to be categories? It wasn't talking about a specific model, but I'm going to answer it referring to the internalizing and externalizing model, which is pictured. So one thing to mention is that it's not black and white. So dimensional hierarchical models are just an idea of a type of model. It doesn't mean that they won't necessarily have categories. It just means that they're trying to conceptualize things either in a hierarchy, so in different levels, or in dimensions. So in this case, it's a hierarchical model because of the hierarchy. So because you have internalizing as a higher level factor, and then after that you have anxious misery or fear, and then after that we have MDD, GAD, panic, social phobia. So that's a hierarchy. That's why it's hierarchical model. So like Dr. Weinberg mentioned in the class, one of the criticisms behind this specific model is that it does look like the DSM in the bottom. You do eventually get to categories, but it's just trying to conceptualize. It's trying to think of disorders not just because having categories. Sometimes you may think that disorders are completely separate from each other. So, for example, the DSM, you might think that MDD and GAD and panic and social phobia are completely unrelated things. But this model is trying to capture the fact that those disorders are all internalizing, so they all have something in common. They're not just completely distinct categories. So, last question, and then I'm going to move on to the questions not in the discussion board. It was about RDoC, so just asking me to go over RDoC. So that's a research initiative to redefine how we understand mental illness in just a broader form and constructs. So instead of having the categorical boxes of the DSM, we're starting to categorize them in terms of dimensional systems that are fundamental to human functioning. So for example, in these systems, what makes this really a dimensional model is that they are, for example, arousal, the very last level, that is normative to some extent. So everyone has arousal to some extent. Arousal is just things like, for example, physical bodily reactivity to things. So for example, sweating, your heart beating fast. So everyone has arousal to some extent. At one point, so that's a dimensional thing, right? It's like a spectrum. Some people have low arousal, some people have medium arousal, some people have slightly elevated arousal. At some point, it becomes a problem. So if you're having, for example, and this is a feature of panic disorder, for example, which we're going to get into, they suffer from, in panic attacks, you start suffering from very high arousal, very high heart rate, you start sweating for no apparent reason. So that's kind of example of just extremely high arousal where you're starting to get into psychopathology. So that's the idea of the dimensional models like the RDoC, is to have these different domains, or rather systems, and they're dimensional because they're normative to some extent, but at one point it starts getting into psychopathology territory. And yeah, once again, like Dr. Weinberg mentioned in the class, if you carve it up, so if you can make categories out of that, right? So it's not necessarily, not using categories at all. It's just focusing on the dimensions. It's just a different conceptualization. So yeah, and then another thing about RDoC is that you're also looking at different units of analysis, which are on the columns in the table. So things like, for example, genes, molecules, cells, circuits, all the way to self-reports. So for example, going back to arousal, you could see the idea is to measure arousal in different units of analysis. So we're measuring, for example, in cells. That's a little too minute of a level unit of analysis, actually, but physiology, right? You could see with arousal, you could see a certain type of brain activity, a certain pattern of brain activity related to arousal. If you put people who are, suffer from very high arousal in like an MRI machine, you might see that in their brain. And you might see that in another unit of analysis, behavior, which is, just seeing them, their heart palpitate and sweating. That's the behavior associated with arousal. And you can see it also in self-reports. So for example, they may, fill out a questionnaire and say, yeah, like I sweat, to every small thing. My heart beats very quickly sometimes, and I can't control it. So yeah, the idea is to be looking at these systems, these dimensional systems in multiple units of analysis. Okay, so I'm done with the questions from the discussion board. I started at 8:05, so I'm going to go until like 9:05-ish. So for now, I'm going to go into the questions that are on the chat. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to everything. I'm going to start with the first question that was brought up. But if you have any questions, use the chat, and if I have time to get to them, I will. If not, email me or come see me in office hours tomorrow at 10 a.m. And we can have a chat. I can help you go through those. So the first question was by Juan. Should we memorize all data in the table of rates of disorders and probands and relatives regarding mania and MDD? So I don't know what table you're talking about specifically. I think it was the table that I mentioned. Let me see if I can bring it up. I think you're talking about this table over here. So this table, again, Dr. Weinberg may have talked about this in class too. I wouldn't focus too much on the percentages. I doubt that she's going to ask you something like, if a relative is diagnosed with MDD, what is the percentage that a proband will have bipolar 1? And then be like 9%, 10%, 11%, 12%. Like that's too high of a level of detail. Whenever you're getting tables like this, focus on what Dr. Weinberg said in class. So focus on her actual words. Focus on, go back to the lecture, see exactly what she said. Focus on what she said, because she's usually emphasizing the main points of the table. She's not going through and reading the table like 3%, 1%, 0.5%, right? So focus on that. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Let me see the next one. So Megan's question seems to have been answered by Erica. Dash. So again, everyone, that was mentioned in the discussion board. I can't really answer. Should we know this for the exam? Do we have to know this for the exam? I can't answer that. I didn't write the exam. I haven't even seen it. So I can't. I can't answer that for sure. But if you need to know numbers or concepts for, do we just need to know that conditions like this are hereditary, or do we need to know exactly how hereditary? So I would again, I can't answer this for sure, but I I think it's, focus less on the details and focus more on the general things. So if you can know both, great. But the more important thing is to know things like, for example, this is hereditary, rather than knowing exactly how hereditary it is, rather than, knowing, oh yeah, it's like 12.5% hereditary. Things like prevalences as well, like when you see different prevalence rates of, major depressive disorder and bipolar and that kind of thing. So what you want to focus on in those types of instances is things like, for example, MDD is more prevalent than bipolar. So that's a fact that's on the table. Remember that. Remember that MDD is more common than bipolar. You don't have to remember that the prevalence rate of MDD is 12% and bipolar is 2% and something like that. Remember just the big pictures when you have things like numbers like that. Brianna, yeah, that's a good point. I don't remember Dr. Weinberg talking about this in the lecture. When I answered the question about hypomania and mania, I looked at the textbook and I looked at the DSM, and I didn't see any significant differences apart from just the duration. But if Dr. Weinberg mentioned this, I would definitely go back to that. So for those of you who are a little confused about those, definitely go back to the lecture, see what Dr. Weinberg says about it, and if you still have questions, let me know. I'm going to make sure to go back to that just to make sure that I'm in the loop as well. Does RDoC have the same characteristic than the DSM? So I don't know what you mean by characteristics, but the RDoC is very different from the DSM because the RDoC, first of all, is a research initiative. No one uses RDoC to diagnose patients. So if you go to like a clinic, no one is going to like fill out this table and try to fill out this table for you. It's more of a research initiative to kind of change how we understand mental illness. So because precisely there are so many issues with the categorical approach of the DSM, people have been starting to think of dimensional systems like the RDoC to kind of change how we understand mental illness. So yeah, it's quite different from the DSM. I don't know if that's what you meant by having the same characteristics. I hope that helps. If you have a more specific question, email me. So any last minute questions? I have still a couple minutes. Just gonna hold on. So by the way, if you have any questions about whatever I said in the review session, or if you come up with a last minute question, feel free to email me, or rather email the class T email account, and I'll get back to you. And also I'm holding office hours tomorrow at 10 a.m. Until 11 a.m. It's on 2001 McGill College, the psychology department building, room 471, I think it is. It's right next to the psych advisors, so right next to Julia and Paula's rooms. So yeah, if you want to come by and talk, just feel free to stop by. I'm going to be there to answer any last minute questions. Yeah, just remember that I can't answer any questions like, will this be on the exam? Will that be on the exam? And yeah, so it seems like there is no more questions, so I'm gonna stop streaming. So thank you for everyone who watched, and yeah, everyone stay warm, and good luck studying and good luck tomorrow. See you guys then. And yeah, like I said, stop by my office hours tomorrow at 10 a.m. or send me an email if you have any last minute questions, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Okay, so best of luck studying, and until tomorrow.